Hey everyone, it's Sonali, and welcome to the second episode of The Lumina Show. Each episode will dive into a topic of interest to my generation, Gen Z. Today, we have a very special guest, TV news anchor, an investigative journalist for the award-winning 6ABC's Action News, TEDx speaker, and creator of the documentary series This is America, Miss Nidia Han. Thank you so much for joining me today, Miss Han.
Thank you so much for having me, Sonali. It is an honor, and I'm so happy to talk to you today.
Absolutely. You've made it your passion in life to share diverse stories and give voices to those who are often underrepresented and overlooked in society. So thank you so much for being here.
It is my pleasure. I'm actually working on a story today about the disparities in the people who are being infected and who are dying from the coronavirus. So, yes, it is definitely my mission to amplify these stories and to help people move in and understand each other a little bit better and understand our realities a little bit better.
That's really great to hear. Today I wanted to talk to you about what it means to be an American and furthermore, who exactly is an American? So to start off, could you briefly talk about your background and what it was like growing up in the United States as a Korean American?
I was born and raised in a small town called Santa Paula. It's in Ventura County, California. When most people think about California, I think they think about San Francisco or Los Angeles, and they think about a very diverse place. But where I grew up, very few people looked like me. I was either the only or one of very few Asian Americans in my neighborhood, in my school, the whole time I was growing up. And so I was always used to feeling different and being different. But I really did embrace and I was proud of being Asian American and Korean American, while at the same time kind of wanting to fit in as best and as well as I could. So that was sometimes in a little bit of conflict. But I think I found ways to really find my own identity and to really find a way to be a proud American. One of the things my parents always taught me is to really be an American, you have to embrace and acknowledge the gifts of your ancestors. And so I think that's what I've always tried to do and I continue to do today and try to pass on to my own kids now.
I think you've also mentioned in the past how when you were in high school, you tried to embrace the American culture and became a cheerleader. And then in college, the people you thought would accept you didn't, and they called you names like banana, which means yellow on the outside and white on the inside. And when I read that, I was intrigued because names like that have only increased in numbers over the years. There's coconut, which means brown on the outside and white on the inside, and Oreo, which means black on the outside and white on the inside. Can you describe how you were in that limbo where you were trying to balance your ethnic tradition, but also maintain the firm belief that you were and are an American?
So, my parents really taught me to understand the gifts of being Korean American. So they really made sure that I spoke Korean, that I understood our culture and our traditions. And so every New Year's, for instance, I would do sebae, which is big bow, to my parents and to my grandmother if she was with us that year for the holiday. And I loved doing those things. And part of me loved being different and having that to sort of bring into the world. On the other hand, in high school, I wanted to fit in and I became a cheerleader because to me that was sort of the most American thing that I could do and the most American uniform that I felt like I could put on. And so, I don't know that I felt like I needed to be one or the other, but I feel like I tried to be my best Korean American self in a lot of ways. But there were times where I felt like I couldn't really fit in and I didn't really belong in the ways that I really wanted to, especially as a teenager. And so when I went to Northwestern University for college, I was really excited because I knew that there was a larger, not only Asian American, but Korean American population there. And I tried to become a member of this Korean American student group. And I was really hurt when I realized and overheard some people referring to me as a Twinkie and then a banana, yellow on the inside, but white, or I'm sorry, yellow on the outside, but white on the inside. And I guess, trying to fit in and growing up in a place where there weren't a lot of Korean Americans had an effect on the person I had become and the person I was. And I also think a lot of people in that community didn't realize that in many ways, perhaps I was sort of more Korean than they were. I speak Korean. I spent many, many summers in Korea. I, again, honored the traditions of being Korean. And so it was very hurtful. And I think that they pegged me incorrectly too. But, moving on from that, I learned a lot from that experience, understanding that sometimes you can even be sort of discriminated against by people in your own group, by people who look like you. And that to me was pretty illuminating.
I think that's a really interesting point. You've mentioned in your 2019 TED Talk that when you heard those comments, you would sort of put on this armor to protect yourself from those comments. How has your strategy evolved over time dealing with those negative comments, especially now as a TV news reporter?
So my armor was my smile. I would just, make it seem like it didn't affect me, it didn't hurt me, it didn't impact me. Sticks and stones may break my bones, that type of thing, right? What I do now is very much address differences, address ignorance, and certainly I address racism. I think it's really important, especially for Asian Americans, to change our own narrative. And we can only do that by being loud, making some noise, being vocal, and really bringing these incidents to the fore and bringing these differences to the fore and talking about them. And so, a few years ago, a driver, for instance, yelled, "This is America" at me. And I responded to her in a live Facebook video and explained to her and to everyone who has ever made me feel like other how it feels and why I disagree, and all the ways in which I am very much American and as American as anyone else. And I think it is important that I do that for the next generation too. I think a lot about our kids. I have a third grader and a first grader. And, as much as I had a great childhood, and there are ways in which I think I am perhaps a stronger person because of my experience and those times in which I did struggle. I hope that they have an easier experience than I did.
So to jump into that story about the This Is America documentary, you were walking in a Philadelphia street and the driver came, and as she was driving away, she said, "This is America," right?
Yes.
A few days after this incident, you made a Facebook Live video in response. Let's try and play a clip of that now.
I have lived in all different parts of America. This is America. And by the way, I probably know America better than you do in other ways as well. I know my U.S. history. I can name every cabinet member. I can name every state capital. Can you? Yet you have the audacity and the ignorance to yell at me that this is America? Are you kidding me? You see this face and you think this face belongs to an outsider or a foreigner? And let me tell you something. I have 2 kids. They have this same face, especially my daughter. She's a carbon copy of me. And if you see her on the street, and if you say anything to her to suggest that she is an interloper or an outsider or a trespasser or someone who does not belong in this country, I challenge you to think again.
What were your thoughts going in through your head when you posted that Facebook Live video in response?
So right after she said that to me, first of all, I was already in a bit of a shock because she almost hit me with her car as I was crossing the street. And so there was that shock. And then I was further shocked when she yelled, "This is America" at me. And so that happened on a Friday. And, I didn't in the moment think it was that big of a deal. But then I realized that I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I was lying awake on Friday night thinking of all the things I wished I had said to her. And then Saturday night, as I was trying to go to sleep, the same thing. I just couldn't stop thinking about it. And, again, the first thing that I thought of when she yelled, "This is America" at me was our children. And I thought, thank goodness they're not with me, because how would I explain to them why she said that and why it hurt me so much? So then on Sunday, when I was anchoring, as I normally do on Sunday mornings at noon, and we were already doing these Facebook Lives on the weekends, I thought, I'm just going to talk to her and talk about this on this Sunday. And so I did, and I never thought that that video would go viral or that it would end up having such a big impact. So I did the live video and then went to my desk and went to Facebook and was so surprised when I could see the number of views and responses, reactions, shares ticking up and up and up and up. And it really made me think that I didn't want to leave the conversation there. I wanted to have a deeper conversation about why this small incident and my little video struck such a big chord with so many people. And it made me think about race and racism and who we are as Americans. And it seemed like a conversation really needed to be had. In this time, 3 years later, with the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of people are now having this conversation, but at the time, not as many people were. And so I was really honored to have the opportunity to get people to discuss these topics, which impact us all.
So to talk a little bit about the numbers and feedback you got on the video, over 3 million views and 16,000 comments, which I'm sure created a lot of dialogue, a lot of people supporting you, and then some people saying that you were in the wrong. One of the most things that stood out to me is that you made it a point in your documentary series, This is America, to reach out to those people in the comments under your video who disagreed with you, and then you had a conversation with them outside of social media to kind of try and understand each other. Why did you feel like that was so important?
When I was creating the docuseries, I did it with the intention of getting people to move in and to understand people who are different from them. And what I thought about as I was creating the docuseries is, how do I create this series so that it is watched by everyone and it brings everyone to the table instead of just preaching to the choir? I had a feeling that a lot of Asian Americans would watch it because I was hosting it, because they already want to talk about this experience. I knew from the comments on my Facebook page that a lot of other communities of color would be watching it. But I wanted to figure out how to bring in, especially white people and people who disagreed with my message, no matter their race, religion, or background. And by the way, I have never revealed the skin color of the person who yelled "This is America" at me, because to me, it doesn't really matter. To me, what matters is that we all look at each other with perhaps a fresh lens, and also look inside ourselves and see where our biases lie and address those, because only then really can we have an honest conversation and really try to move forward in terms of inclusion and equity and real diversity. And so, so from the beginning, that was my intention, to try to talk to and understand people who clearly have a different point of view and a different experience, to try to understand what has informed that experience, why they have that point of view, to see if we could find some common ground. And I was really surprised to find that we have a lot in common. So one of the people who really sparked a lot of dialogue on Facebook, because his comment made it clear that he didn't like my video, was a guy named Wayne. And he talked to me via email, but then when I asked him if he would sit down and talk to me in person and on camera, he ghosted me. Like I never heard from him again.
Right.
So I found his home address and showed up at his house one day. And to my surprise, he invited me in. But this is where my bias lies, right? Like I had envisioned this awful monster of a person who lives in his basement and, lives in a terrible house or what have you. And the truth is, he's a really nice guy. He has 2 kids about my kids' ages. And we have a lot in common. Like we're both basketball fans. Our priorities are our children. We have the same dreams for our families. We both have crazy work schedules. And so we found that common ground. And by doing that, it opened up a space to dialogue about our differences. And it turns out he had been on his own journey of trying to better understand people who look different from him. And that was really revelatory for me too, to understand that I had walked into this conversation with certain expectations and biases, and he was able to educate me too. So it was great.
I think that's just the greatest thing about dialogue, is that both parties end up learning so much. And especially now, dialogue is so important because of the time we're in with the coronavirus, which has not only brought along sickness and unemployment, but as you stated before, a wave of racism, one of them being against Asian Americans that you wrote about recently in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Your first sentences were, "My dad doesn't have the coronavirus, neither do I, please don't treat us like we do." What are your parents' thoughts when they see that you are undergoing these racist mentalities from other people?
I'm happy to say that my father has expressed pride in the fact that I am speaking out and talking about it and calling out racism and ignorance. It's interesting because, growing up, I don't know that they ever said to me, don't say anything, just ignore it. But I certainly didn't feel encouraged or motivated by my parents or their own behavior to speak up. And I've never really had a conversation. My mother has passed, but I never had a conversation with my dad about, what he thought I should have done when we were younger, what he might have done when he was younger, because he came to the States in the 1970s. And I guess it's just something that we kind of lived with. It was just our reality as we know it. And really, I don't think anyone thought about trying to change it. That's kind of a new thing. And so I sort of get the sense from my father that this is a new time. And he's glad that in this new age, I am doing this work. And I know, he has said that he's proud of me. And I know that video that you mentioned that went viral, he sent that to all of his friends. So I guess he's proud of it, and is glad that I'm doing it.
I think with Thanksgiving coming along, racism will be a really, really big topic. One of those big table talks, as people call it. Let me just illustrate a scenario really quickly. Let's say there's a Gen Zer who's trying to talk about race and what it means to be an American. How should they go about having that conversation with an individual or loved one who they might disagree with?
I think to come into the conversation with genuine curiosity. So I think if you decide to have that conversation, and by the way, no one says you have to have that conversation.
Right.
And it's okay not to. It's okay to decide on Thanksgiving, we are going to talk about everything but politics or race or these divisive topics about which we cannot agree. But if you decide to have the conversation, my advice is to approach that conversation with genuine curiosity, not with the intention of trying to change someone's mind or arguing or debating, but perhaps just to ask why that person has that point of view. What has informed that point of view? What has been that person's experience? And then just being very open and honest and explaining, how you feel and why, I think that conversation could be productive and constructive. But I think if you go into it with the idea that you're going to change this person or school this person or enlighten this person, I think you might have a tough time.
Is there any way to keep that conversation going if you choose to?
For the Gen Z in that example?
Right.
I think so. I think one of the things that might be great is to, as things come up in the news, for instance, to take very specific stories and examples, or examples and stories from history or what have you, and then use those to open up a conversation. I wonder if the Gen Z can even ask the other family member, is this a conversation you'd be willing to have again? And can we plan on that? And, you know, if you want to, can we set up a regularly scheduled time to have it? Because sometimes, too, I think you have to make sure that the other person is also in the right frame of mind, has sort of the emotional, mental space to have that discussion in that moment. Because sometimes I think timing is everything, right? So if you come at me at a time when I'm trying to make sure the turkey is ready and the potatoes are still going to be hot and the candles are lit on the table, I'm not ready to have this conversation. So that's another reason why sometimes I think Thanksgiving dinner is exactly the wrong time to have this conversation. And again, why I think if you're going to have it, you have to really think about how to have it.
I think that's really important advice for everyone to hear. Thank you so much for joining me today, Miss Han. I really appreciate your time.
It was my pleasure. And just one thing, you know, I talked about the people who expressed support and solidarity for my Facebook video. And I just want to make very clear that there was such diversity within that group. I mean, there were, you know, people who talked about their Irish immigrant experience, their Italian immigrant experience, their Black, Hispanic, Latino, you know, what have you experience. So it was another thing that also made me realize that at the end of the day, we all do have, especially in our histories, the same experience. And we have so much more in common, and we're so much more alike than we are different. And that's just something I don't think I expressed that well earlier, so I wanted to say now.
I think one of the greatest things about being an American is that there's so much diversity, but we all have so much in common.
Thank you everyone for listening, and we really appreciate your time. My name once again is Sonali, and I'll see you again for the next episode of The Lumina Show. Bye everyone!